The first thing Naya of Care knew, when she came back to herself, was that her hands were full of something warm and sharp and breathing. The second thing she knew was that her husband's pyre was still hot at her back, and the wind off the salt flats was carrying his ash down the long slope toward the brackish sea. The third thing she knew was that the 3 shells she had walked into the fire holding had cracked open against her ribs while she sat in the coals, and that what had come out of them was now coiled across her forearms and her collarbone, and the hollow under her chin, and that they were looking at her the way a child looks at a mother, before it has learned the word for it. She was 22 years old. She had been a queen for 11 months. She had been a widow for 1 day. The 3 living things on her body had no names. The shells had been a gift, decades dry, given to her at her wedding by an embassy from a coast no one in her husband's court could place on a map. Curiosities, the steward had called them. Heat-cracked stone. Pretty. She had set them on a low stand in her sleeping chamber because she had nothing else of her own in that palace, and she had looked at them at night when she could not sleep and could not say why. 2 nights ago, she had carried them into the fire because the priests had told her not to. The priests had said the foreign queen would not be permitted to mourn at the rim of the pyre. The priests had said the foreign queen would observe from the lower terrace with the household women. The foreign queen had walked past them carrying her dead husband's 3 foreign stones in the bowl of her wedding shawl, and she had sat down at the coal edge with the shells in her lap, and she had not gotten up when the wood went up, and she had not gotten up when the wood burned down, and she had not gotten up at dawn when the wind shifted, and when the household women came at noon to bring out the bones, they had found her sitting in the cold ash with the bowl of her shawl pulled open, and 3 small wet creatures looking up at her out of it. The household women had not screamed. That was the first detail Naya would remember. Later, when she had to remember things in order, the household women had set down the urn and the cloth and the small iron tongs, and they had not screamed. And the oldest of them, a woman named Bessa, who had been her husband's wet nurse and his mother's wet nurse before that, had walked the last 3 paces of cold ash on her bare feet and knelt beside the queen and put one hand very carefully on the queen's shoulder and said, in the dialect Bessa used only with infants and with the gravely ill, "Get up, my lamb. They will want to see you." The creature on Naya's left forearm was the color of a candle flame held against a stone wall, orange at the body, fading to a pale gold at the wing edge, with eyes the color of wet river clay. The creature on her right forearm was darker, a deep red-brown like cooled iron, with eyes the color of a winter sky. The creature against her throat was smaller than either of the others, the size of a kitchen cat, and was so pale it was almost white, with eyes that had not yet learned how to focus, and when Naya breathed, it breathed with her, and when she swallowed it, pressed its small, wet nose against the soft skin under her jaw, and made a sound that was not a sound she had a word for. She got up. Bessa caught her under the elbow. "They will want to see you," Bessa said again. "Who will?" "All of them, lamb. The priests, the brother, the lords of the 7 havens, the embassy from your father's coast, the captain of the harbor watch, the boy who brings up the milk, every man with a window. I cannot put these down. No, lamb. They will hold them against me. They will hold everything against you," Bessa said. "That is what they are for. Walk." The 3 creatures did not fall when she walked. The orange one wound its tail around her wrist, with the unhurried confidence of a thing that has always lived there. The red-brown one shifted to her shoulder, and dug its small claws into the fabric of her widow's shawl and held. The pale one stayed at her throat. She crossed the cold ash with Bessa's hand under her elbow and her hair full of charcoal, and the 3 small creatures riding her like she had been built for them, and at the rim of the pyre field, the household women stepped aside for her, and at the gate, the priests stepped aside for her, and on the long path back to the palace, the gardeners and the stable boys and the kitchen women stepped aside for her, and by the time she reached the lower terrace, she was no longer Naya of Care, the widow of King Halen. She was something else. She had not yet been told what. She crossed the lower terrace into the receiving hall, and her dead husband's younger brother, Prince Velden, stood up from the high chair he had been sitting in. He was a tall man, with a long, pale face and a habit of looking at his hands when he spoke. And he was 19 years old, and he had been the regent of the kingdom for exactly 14 hours. The orange creature on Naya's wrist saw him and made a low sound in its chest that was not a hiss and not a hum, and was, she would later understand, the first warning sound any of her three would ever give about a man. Veldan looked at his hands. "Sister," he said, "I had thought you lost in the fire." "No. The household women came back without the urn. They came back without the bones. The bones are still out there. We will collect them this evening. The fire was hotter than they planned. And these," he said, still looking at his hands, "are mine." He raised his eyes then. He looked at her for a long time. He did not look frightened, which was, she would later think, the first surprise of his regency. "Sit, please. There is a great deal to discuss." "Cram. I will stand. The lords are arriving. Then I will be standing when they arrive." He folded his pale hands together on the table. The orange creature watched him over the rim of her wrist. The pale one breathed against her throat. The dark one sat on her shoulder like a hawk that had already been hooded and was not concerned about the bird catcher. "Naya," Veldan said, "I am very sorry about my brother." "Thank you. And I am very sorry," he said, "for what I am about to ask you to do." The lords of the Seven Havens arrived before sundown. They had been on the road since the first signal fire 2 days before, and they brought with them their household guards and their seal scribes and their second wives and their long arguments about the succession of a king who had died without an heir, and they walked into the hall of Velaskar, expecting to find a frightened girl widow and a nervous boy prince, and a clean room in which to negotiate the dismemberment of a small coast kingdom, and they walked out, 4 hours later, having sworn a provisional oath to a woman they had been prepared to put on a ship by the next tide. It was not a coup. It was something more difficult to name. Naya did not raise her voice. She did not threaten. She did not, in fact, speak more than 50 sentences in the entire 4 hours. She stood at the head of the long table with the 3 small creatures on her arms and her shoulder and her throat, and she let the lords see them. And she let the lords' household guards see them, and she let the lords' seal scribes write down what they had seen. And at the end of the 4 hours, the eldest of the 7, a salt-wind-burned old man called Tomas of Estrin by the mole, set his cup down and said into the long silence the thing that Bessa had been waiting to hear since dawn. "My king died yesterday," Tomas said. "He left us no son. He left us a widow with 3 living wonders on her shoulders. I am too old to pretend that means nothing. I will hold Estrin for her until she names what she is." The second oldest, a woman called Vass of the Upper River, set her cup down without saying anything and pushed the cup toward the center of the table, which in the customs of that coast was the same as Tomas's words. The third did the same. The fourth, the fifth, the sixth, a thin man with a clever mouth named Pelin of the Inland Reach, did not push his cup. He folded his arms. He looked at Naya. "And what?" he said. "Are you?" The dark creature on her shoulder stirred. Naya raised one hand very slightly, and the dark creature settled. "I do not yet know," she said. "I will know when I do." That is not an answer. It is the only honest one available to me today. And tomorrow? Tomorrow I will know more than I know today. The day after I will know more than tomorrow. I will not pretend to know things I do not. If that is unacceptable to you, Pelin, you may leave the hall, and your reach with you. Pelin looked at her for a long time. He was not a stupid man. He had reached the table by being the cleverest second son in 3 generations of inland reaches. And he had watched 2 coastal queens come and go in his lifetime. And he could weigh a room. He weighed this one. He pushed his cup. The 7th lord, who had been waiting to see what the other 6 did, pushed his too. It was done. Veldan, in the high chair, did not look up from his hands. Naya thought, very briefly, and with a clarity that surprised her, that her dead husband's brother had not pushed a cup of his own. She filed that thought in the place she had begun, at noon, to keep things she would need later. That night, in the chamber that had been her husband's and was now hers alone, She sat on the low stand where the 3 shells had stood, and she let the 3 creatures crawl off her body onto the bedding, and she watched them for a long time. The orange one tested the air with its tongue. It found the dish of water Bessa had brought. It drank. It looked at Naya for permission before it touched the strip of cured fish Bessa had also brought. And when she nodded, it ate the fish in 2 efficient swallows. The dark one walked to the edge of the bed and looked down at the floor, which was perhaps 6 times its body length below. And after a careful moment, it opened its wings, which were the size of a man's 2 hands, and it glided down to the floor and walked the perimeter of the room and came back and glided up again and resumed its place on the pillow. The pale one did not leave her lap. She put one hand very gently on its small head. It was so warm, her palm pulled back without permission. The pale one made the not sound it had made at the pyre, the low-pressed hum against her throat. And she put her hand back, and it pushed up into her palm the way her brother's hound had pushed up into her palm when she was a child and the hound was old. "I will not be able to put any of you down," she said quietly. "Ever. Will I?" The pale one breathed against her thumb. "All right," she said. She named them, that night, the only names she would ever give them. The orange she called Sarah, which in her father's coast tongue meant first light. The dark she called Othran, which meant the long road. The pale one she called Veska. It was a child's word. The kind of word a mother makes up for a sound a baby makes, before the baby has a word of its own. Veska tucked her small white head into the hollow of Naya's collarbone and slept. Naya did not sleep. She sat upright with her back against the bedhead and one hand on Veska's flank, and she watched the lamp burn down. And she thought, with a precision that made her throat ache, about all the people in her father's coast and in her dead husband's kingdom, and in the inland reaches, and in the open havens, and in the 7 embassies, and in the high courts of the 4 large kingdoms north of the sea, who were, at that moment, 2 days into reading what their own messengers had written from her pyre. She was 22 years old. She had 3 living wonders on her bed. She had a regent brother-in-law who had not pushed a cup. She had 11 months of marriage as her only training for what was coming. Power, she understood for the first time in her life, did not arrive in the size in which one could carry it. It arrived in the size in which it had been made. And one was simply required, from that night forward, to grow strong enough to lift it before it crushed everything one had loved. She set her hand more firmly on Veska's flank. She did not sleep. The first letter arrived from her father's coast on the 11th morning. The runner had been on the road for 9 days, and had killed 2 horses to make it in 9, and he came up the long lower terrace with his cloak black with sweat and the sealed tube in both hands, the way a child carries a bird with a broken wing. Bessa took the tube from him at the gate. Naya broke the seal in the receiving hall with Sarah perched on the back of the high chair, and Othran on the table's edge, and Veska, as always, against her throat. The letter was in her father's hand. Her father had not written to her in 2 years. The marriage to King Halen had been her father's idea. Her father had said many things about the value of an alliance with a Salt Coast kingdom. He had not written, even when Halen fell ill in the spring, even when the second letter from Veliskar asked for the family's prayer. He wrote now. She read the letter twice. She set it down on the table. Bessa, who could not read but who could read a face, sat down across from her. "He wants them," Naya said. "The wonders. He wants them sent home on the next tide. He says they are a child's gift from a forgotten coast, and they belong in the family vault. He says he understands that I am attached to them. He says he will allow me to visit them when I return home, which he expects me to do, also on the next tide, having concluded my duties as a widow. He does not say widow queen. He does not. He says child. He does. And the wonders. He says they are unstable. He says the captains who have come back from this coast tell him that one of them has begun to make a humming sound when men approach. He says the kingdom of Veliskar is not equipped to manage what he calls a developing situation. He says, in 3 different ways, that he will send a ship. And you, lamb." Naya put her hand on the back of Sira's neck. Sira, who had been watching the runner through the open door, turned her head and pressed her cheek into Naya's palm. Sarah's scales had darkened in the last week, from candle orange to the deep orange of a banked forge. She was the size, now, of a young goat. "I will write him back," Naya said. "And I will tell him that he raised me well. I will tell him that he taught me what a treaty meant. I will tell him that I am the Queen Regent of Velaskar, by the unanimous oath of the Seven Havens. I will tell him that the wonders are not his to recall, and were never his to give. I will tell him that I have named them. I will tell him I miss him. And the ship may come. The wonders are not on it when it leaves." Bessa nodded once. "He will be angry, lamb. He has been angry with me before. He survived it. I survived it. The wonders are not negotiable." Sira, under her hand, made a low sound that was not the warning sound. It was something else. It was a sound Naya would, in another 6 months, learn to recognize as the sound the orange dragon made when she was satisfied with a decision someone she loved had made in her hearing. It was the first time Naya heard it. It was not the last. By the second autumn after the Pyre, Sarah had outgrown the inner courtyard. It happened the way everything with the three of them happened. There was no day on which it happened. There was a morning when the courtyard had felt large enough, and a morning 2 weeks later when Naya walked into it with Sarah at her hip, and the chickens scattered in a way that suggested they had begun to understand that a thing the size of a dray horse was now a thing with which they shared. A yard. The chickens had been right. By the end of that autumn, Sarah was the size of a small barn. By the following spring, she was the size of a barn. Othrin grew differently. Othrin was, by the second autumn, the size of a large dog, and would, Naya eventually understood, never be larger. Othrin was built for distance. Othrin's wings, when fully open, were nearly 3 times the span of her body. And Othrin could ride a thermal up out of the courtyard, at first light, and not return to the high terrace until just before sundown. And when she came back, she would shake the high air off her shoulders, the way a seabird shakes off the spray, and she would land on the railing and stretch, and then walk the long stretch of the upper colonnade on her own 4 feet, the way a person walks home after a long good day. Veska did not grow. That was what Bessa called it. After the first year, when it had become clear, Veska had stopped at the size of a kitchen cat, and showed no sign of intending to be larger. Her scales had stayed pale. Her eyes had finished focusing on the world, and had turned out to be the color of moonstone, which the household women said was a color the gods only used for one thing in a generation. Bessa would not say what the household women meant by it. Naya did not ask. Veska rode Naya's shoulder, year after year. Veska slept in the curve of Naya's throat. Veska watched everything that happened in the receiving hall with a focus that was not the focus of an animal. And on 3 separate occasions in the second year, Veska had, very quietly, and without making any sound at all, simply turned her small head and looked at a visitor in such a way that the visitor had become, within the hour, unwilling to complete the business he had come to do, and had begged Naya's leave to return another day, and had then never returned at all. Naya did not understand how Veska did this. Naya did not ask. Naya simply, in the second year, began to watch Veska's small white head whenever a new face entered her hall, and to make decisions accordingly. The 7 lords, by the end of the second year, had ceased calling her Queen Regent. They had begun to call her, in the old word of the Salt Coast, Hen Kale, which meant the one who carries. They had not asked her permission. They had simply begun, and she had not corrected them. And the word had spread to the kitchens, and the stables, and the harbor watch, and the milk boys, and by the end of the 3rd year, there was no one in Velaskar who called her anything else. And when the second letter from her father arrived, angrier than the first, more careful, asking by what authority she had refused him, she signed her response, Hen Kale, Queen of the Salt Coast, and she sealed it with a seal she had cut herself. A seal with 3 small wings on it, and she sent it. Her father did not write a third letter. The first kingdom to test her was the inland kingdom of Bras-Halor, in the 4th spring. Bras-Halor had been content, in the first 3 years after Helen's death, to send polite letters and a modest annual gift of salt, and to pretend that the wonders on the salt coast were a charming local curiosity that the inland court need not concern itself with. In the 4th spring, a new king sat in Bras-Halor's seat, the old king's 3rd nephew, a soft-faced man named Inrith, and Inrith had decided, within 6 weeks of his coronation, that a queen on the southern coast, with 3 living dragons, was an intolerable insult to the natural order of inland kingdoms. He marched a column of 1,400 men over the Lore Pass in the 2nd week of the spring thaw. He brought with him 300 archers and 40 wagons of supply and a single captured priest of Naya's father's coast, whom he intended to use as a translator if the conversation went well, and as a hostage if it did not. He sent ahead of his column a herald with a sealed letter that named 12 grievances and demanded the surrender of the 3 wonders, the abdication of Hen-Kale in favor of Veldon, and the immediate opening of the inland trade road that had been closed since the 2nd year, which Inrith called a violation of long custom, and Naya called a sensible response to inland kingdoms who could not keep their archers on their own side of the pass. The herald arrived at the lower terrace at noon on the 4th day of the column's march. Naya received him in the open courtyard, with Sarah coiled at her back like a wall, the color of a banked forge, and Othrin on the railing above, and Veska, as always, against her throat. Bessa, who was 74 years old now, and who had begun in the last year to walk with a cane carved by the harbor master's son, stood at Naya's left elbow. The herald, a young man with very good manners, read the letter aloud, without faltering. He read all 12 grievances. He read the 3 demands. He read the closing salutation in which his king assured Hen-Kale of his fondest regards in this difficult moment. He rolled the letter up. He bowed. "I am instructed to await your reply, madam." "Tomas," Naya said, without taking her eyes off the herald. The salt wind burned old Lord of Estrin, who had been standing in the colonnade, stepped forward. "Madam, how long is the column?" 1,400. 300 bows. 40 wagons. They will be on the pass road tomorrow at noon, and at the upper river by sundown the day after. They will reach the lower terrace, at their current pace, in 9 days. Have they begun to forage? They began 2 days ago. 3 farms burned, 2 more emptied of grain. 1 miller killed by a wagon master who would not pay. You have the names of the farms. I have, madam. Hold them. We will need them later. She turned back to the herald. The young man had not moved. He was, she noticed, watching Veska. Veska was watching him back. He was sweating very lightly, the way people sweat when they have just understood something they did not expect to have to understand. "Herald," Naya said. "What is your name?" "Falin of Bras-Halor, madame." "Falin." 22, madam. That was my age when my husband died. Sit down. There is bread and water on the side table. Drink first, then eat. Then we will talk. Falin Zot. He did not look at Sarah. He did not look at Othrin. Falin Zera. Falin Zera. He looked, the entire meal, at Veska, and Veska looked back. And at the end of the meal, Falin set down his cup and lifted his face to Naya and said, with the simple honesty of a man whose courage was the only equipment he had brought across the pass, "Madam, my king is going to lose his column. He is. He has not understood that yet. He has not. I cannot go back and tell him. You can. You will. You will tell him exactly what you saw. You will tell him that I sat with you while you ate bread. You will tell him I named the 3. You will tell him their sizes. You will tell him about the small one." She paused. "Tell him especially about the small one. Madam, he will not believe you, Falin. That is not your problem. Your problem is to ride back to him on the second best horse in my stables, and to deliver the truth of what you have seen. And to ask him, on your own account, and not on mine, to turn his column around at the upper river. If he turns the column around, no one in Braz-Halor will die this spring. If he does not turn the column around, I will turn it around for him. With the wonders. With Sarah. Only with Sarah. Othran will keep the upper river clear of his scouts. Veska will stay with me. Sira will fly the column front at first light on the 10th day, and she will set fire to the wagons of supply. Not the men. The wagons. The men will then have a choice. Walk home over the Lore, pass on rations they no longer have, or surrender to the Lord of Estrin, and be fed and sent home in the warm season by the river road. They will all choose the second. I will not have killed any of them. But Inrith will have lost his column. Lo, Lodes Enrith will have lost his column. Fallen sat for a long moment. Madam, I will deliver this exactly. I know you will. Take the horse. He took the horse. He rode out. He delivered the letter exactly as Naya had given it to him, and he delivered the meal, and he delivered the description of Veska. And Inrith did not believe him. And Inrith ordered his column to continue, and on the 10th morning Sira flew the column front at first light, and set fire to 38 of the 40 wagons, and one wagon master died of a fall from a startled horse, and one archer died of an arrow. He loosed wildly into the smoke, and which came back down on the man beside him, and no other man in Inrith's column died that spring. The column surrendered to Tomas of Estrin at the upper river on the 11th day, and Tomas fed them, and Tomas walked them home over the river road in the warm season, and Phelan of Braz-Halor walked at the front of them with his head held up, and his second-best horse alive under him. Inrith of Braz-Halor abdicated at midsummer in favor of a council of 3 reaches. He sent a second letter in the winter, asking, very quietly, whether his abdication had been received as sincere. Naya wrote back, in her own hand, that it had, and that there was a place at her table for him should he wish to visit the Salt Coast in his retirement. Inrith did not come that year. He came the next. He stayed 3 weeks. He sat at Naya's lower table and ate the bread of the kingdom he had marched against. And he wept once, very quietly, at the rail, when Sarah passed overhead on her evening patrol, and on his last day he asked Naya, with the formal address of a man who had thought about the question for a year, whether she would accept the gift of a single horse from the Braz-Halor stables as a token of the inland kingdom's new understanding. She accepted the horse. The horse was a white mare. Naya named her Fallen, and Fallen lived in her stables for 19 years and bore 6 foals, and the line was still running mares on the Salt Coast 100 years later. That was the 4th spring. There were others. None of them taught Naya as much as the first. She had not slept the night before Sarah flew. She had sat with Veska in her lap and Othran on the windowsill, and she had counted, with a precision that bruised her own ribs, the things she was about to ask Sarah to do. She had asked herself what she would do if a man died because of a choice she had made. She had asked herself what she would do if many men died. She had no answer to any of these that satisfied her. She did the thing anyway. The dawn came. Sira flew. The wagons burned. The column surrendered. The men walked home. Naya received the count of the dead that evening from Tomas too, and she had sat in her chamber for an hour without speaking. And Bessa had sat opposite her, and at the end of the hour Naya had said, very quietly, I will carry those 2. I do not get to be the one who burned wagons, and not also be the one who carries the 2. Yes, lamb. And the 3rd time, Bessa. The 3rd time, I have to do something like this. It will be harder, not easier. Will it? And, after buddy, it will be harder until it stops being harder. And the day it stops being harder is the day you set the wonders down and walk into the sea and let someone else carry them. That day will come. Not yet, but it will come. And on that day you will know it has come because you will look at Veska, and Veska will look back, and Veska will say nothing, which she will not have done since the morning of the pyre. And on that day you will walk down to the lower terrace, and you will hand the Salt Coast to whoever you have raised to take it. and you will go home. Home, wherever home becomes. Naya had slept that night. Eventually, in her sleep, Veska pressed up under her chin and breathed against her throat and made the knot sound. And Naya dreamed of the cold ash at her husband's pyre, and of 3 small wet creatures looking up at her, and she woke calmer than she had any right to be. And she went down to the harbor at first light, and walked the lower stones in her bare feet, with Sira wading the shallow water beside her, and she washed her hands in the salt, and she came back up to the receiving hall, and began the day's work. The 5th year was the year of the embassies. Word of Bras Helor's spring had crossed the inland reaches by midsummer, and the northern coasts by autumn. And by the first frost, there were 17 embassies camped on the lower fields of Veliskaya, each bearing letters of formal greeting and quietly worded requests for an audience with Henkael. 2 were from the great cold kingdom of Tarsh Vor, which had not sent an embassy to a salt coast queen in 11 generations. 1 was from her father's coast, led by her younger brother, whom she had not seen in 7 years. 1 was from a desert king, 2 seas to the east, whose eldest daughter had been sent across 2 seas with a chest of cut stones and a careful request for an alliance of mutual defense. Naya received them in order of arrival, in a plain wool gown, and the seal of the 3 wings at her throat. She listened, more than she spoke. She had learned, in 5 years, that a queen who listens is told things, and a queen who is told things knows things, and a queen who knows things does not have to guess. She listened for 41 days. She drank their tea. She admired their gifts. She asked nothing she did not want answered. At the end of the 41 days, she convened a council. She did not call it a court or an alliance. She called it the Standing Council of the Salt and Coast Reaches, and she invited each embassy to nominate 2 persons to sit in it. The seats were not hereditary, and not for life. They sat for 9 years. The council would meet 4 times a year in the receiving hall of Veliskaya. It would have no power to compel any kingdom. It would have, instead, the slow daily power of being a place where the salt and coast reaches could speak to each other before they had to speak through their armies. Henkael, the letter said in its closing line, would attend every session and speak only when asked, and would walk in the lower courtyard at each day's recess with Sarah at her hip and Othrin on her shoulder, and Veska at her throat, so that the embassies, returning home, could carry with them not the threat of the wonders, but the simple daily fact of them. 11 of the 17 accepted. The first session sat the following spring. Naya was 31. She had ruled the Salt Coast for 9 years. She had defused 4 armed columns, brokered 7 trade roads, recognized 2 new inland reaches, refused the marriage proposals of 19 kings and 3 queens, and buried Bessa, who had died in her sleep in the 8th winter, at the age of 78, with one hand on Naya's wrist and the other on Veska's small white flank. She had not yet learned the cost. She would learn it in the 10th year, in a way that left her, at the end, sitting in the cold ash of her own life and looking up at 3 living wonders out of a bowl of widow's shawl all over again, and understanding, for the first time, why the household women at the pyre had not screamed. The cost arrived in the form of a child. The child was not Naya's. Naya had no children. Naya had refused, year after year, the careful suggestions of the 7 lords and the 11 council kingdoms that she ought, for the stability of the coast, to take a consort and produce an heir. The child belonged to a fisherman's wife in the harbor village below the lower terrace, a woman named Mara, whose husband had drowned in the 3rd spring of the council, and who lived in 2 rooms with a cousin and 3 children, the youngest of whom, a girl of 4 called Irish, had been born with a foot that did not turn down all the way, and who walked, for the first 3 years of her life, with a small wooden brace the harbor master's son had carved her. Naya knew the child by sight. The child knew Naya by sight. The child had, on 3 separate occasions in the spring of the 10th year, stood at the lower stone of the harbor terrace when Naya walked down with Sira at first light, and had held out her small hand in the formal way the harbor children had begun to hold out their hands to Sira in the 3rd year of the council, and Sarah had bent her long, forge-colored head and breathed warm air across the small hand, and the child had laughed. On the morning of the cost, the child was not at the lower stone. Naya walked down at first light with Sarah at her hip. The harbor stones were quiet. The fishing boats were already out. The harbor master's son was mending net on the lower jetty. The wind was off the salt flats. The morning had the long, calm quality of a day that has not yet decided what it intends to be. Naya did not, at first, notice the absence of the child. She had been thinking about a letter that had come in the night from the Desert King, whose daughter had grown into a fine ambassador, and who was, the letter said, dying. She had been thinking about the funeral she would have to send a delegation to, and about who would lead it, and about whether she could be spared from the council long enough to lead it herself. She had walked the lower stones with these thoughts, and Sarah had walked beside her. And when she had reached the end of the lower jetty, she had turned and started back. And only then, on the long, quiet walk back, had she registered that the small bare feet that usually came running down the harbor stones at the sight of Sarah had not, that morning, come. She stopped. She looked up the harbor stones. She saw Mara, the fisherman's wife, standing in the doorway of her 2 rooms, with one hand on the frame and the other pressed across her mouth. Mara did not call out. Mara was a woman who had buried a husband and a son, and who did not call out anymore. Naya ran. Sarah came after her at the slow, heavy ground-shaking trot of a barn the size of Sarah. Othran, who had been riding a thermal half a mile out over the bay, saw them running, and turned in the high air, and came down hard. Iresh was on the floor of the inner room. She was not dead. She was, the cousin said in a voice that had no breath behind it, not breathing well. She had not been breathing well since the middle of the night. They had not come up to the terrace because the cousin's wife had said it was only a child's fever and would pass by morning. It had not passed by morning. The child's lips were the color of the harbor stones in winter. The child's small chest was rising and falling in a way that was wrong. Naya knelt on the floor. She had no medicine. The kingdom's medic was on the upper road 2 days out, attending a birth at the upper river farm. The harbor village had a midwife, but the midwife was the cousin's wife, and the cousin's wife was the one who had said it was only a fever and would pass. Veska, on Naya's shoulder, stirred. Naya looked at her. Veska had not, in 10 years, ever moved off Naya's shoulder of her own accord without being asked. Veska had not, in 10 years, ever made any sound louder than the low-pressed hum she made against Naya's throat. Veska had not, in 10 years, looked at any human being who was not Naya for longer than the moment it took to assess them and make them, very quietly, decide to go home. Veska moved off Naya's shoulder. She walked down Naya's arm with the slow, careful weight of an animal who has been waiting 10 years to walk on her own and has now decided that the wait is over. She stepped from Naya's hand onto the rough floor of the inner room. She crossed the floor on her 4 pale feet. She climbed up the wooden box the cousin had pulled out for sitting. She stepped onto the low pallet, where the child Iresh lay with her lips the color of harbor stones. She lay down against the child's small chest. She put her white head under the child's chin, the way she had put her head under Naya's chin every night for 10 years. She closed her moonstone eyes. She breathed. For a long count of breaths, nothing in the room moved. Then Iresh's small chest, which had been rising and falling in the wrong way, rose and fell in the right way, once, then again. The blue at her lips faded. Her hands, which had been curled tight against the wool of her shift, opened. Her eyes did not open. She slept. She slept the deep, clean sleep of a child whose body has been given back to itself. Veska did not move. Naya, on her knees on the floor of the inner room of a fisherman's wife's 2 rooms, watched the small pale dragon she had carried at her throat for 10 years lay against the chest of a 4-year-old harbor child. She had known only by sight, and she understood, with a clarity that did not feel like understanding, but like recognition, that Veska had not stayed at her throat for 10 years because Veska was small. Veska had stayed at her throat for 10 years because Naya had needed her to. The cost was that Veska could not do both things at once. Naya put one hand on the small white flank. It was very warm. It was warmer than Naya had ever felt it. The warmth was leaving it. Naya could feel the warmth leaving it under her palm, the way she had felt the warmth leaving her husband's hand on the last night of his fever. "Veska," she said, very quietly. Veska opened her eyes. The moonstone color had gone faint, the way a window goes faint at first dusk. She looked up at Naya. She did not make any sound. The sound she did not make was not the not sound she had made for 10 years. It was the absence of any sound at all. The small, calm absence of a thing that has finished what it came to do. Veska's voice came to Naya. Then, from 8 years dead the day you look at Veska, and Veska looks back, and Veska says nothing, which she will not have done since the morning of the pyre. Naya bent her head down over the small pale flank, and she pressed her forehead against Veska's small white side, and she did not weep, because the room was full of a frightened fisherman's wife, and a guilty cousin, and a sleeping child, and a queen did not weep in front of people who would have to walk down the harbor stones the next morning and live with what they had seen. She breathed against Veska's flank. She felt Veska breathe back, twice, very softly, and then once more, and then not again. She sat up. She lifted Veska off the child's chest with both hands. Veska's small white body was no heavier than she had been at the pyre. Naya turned, with Veska cradled against her own chest in the bowl of her own arms, and she said to Mara, who had not moved from the doorway, "Your daughter will live. She will sleep until evening. When she wakes, feed her broth. Send word up the terrace if anything changes. I will send the medic down by tomorrow noon. Walk with her every day for the next month. She will run again by midsummer. Madam, Mara, look at me." The fisherman's wife looked at her. The small one chose to do this. I did not send her. I did not ask her. She chose. Do not carry this. There is no debt. Your daughter is your daughter. Raise her well. Mara, who had not wept since her husband had drowned in the 3rd spring, wept then. She did not move from the doorway. She wept, standing up with one hand still on the frame. And Naya walked past her with Veska cradled against her chest. And Sarah was waiting in the harbor stones outside the door with her great forge-colored head lowered all the way to the ground. Sarah had known. Othrin, on the roof of the cousin's wife's small house, had known. They had been waiting. Naya walked up the harbor stones with Veska cradled against her chest, and Sarah walking at her hip, and Othrin on the ridges of the roofs above, and the harbor village stepped out into its doorways and stood there and did not say anything. And at the top of the harbor stones, the lower terrace was already full of the people of the upper court, because Othrin had flown ahead and dropped low across the receiving hall, in the way she had only ever dropped low when something had broken, and the 7 lords, and the council kingdoms, and the kitchen women, and the stable boys, and the harbor master's son were all standing in the open air with their hands at their sides. And Thomas of Estrin, who was 83 years old now and walked with 2 canes, was at the front of them with his old salt wind-burned face turned toward the lower stones. Thomas saw what Naya carried. He did not say anything. He lowered his head. He went down on one of his old knees, on the stone of the lower terrace, very slowly, with the help of a steward at each elbow, and he stayed there. The 7 lords went down with him. The council kingdoms went down. The kitchen women went down. The stable boys went down. The harbor master's son did not go down because he was holding the harbor master's old father up, and the harbor master's old father went down for both of them by lowering his head all the way to his own chest. No one spoke. Naya walked through them with Veska in her arms. She walked through the receiving hall. She walked up the long stair to her own chamber. She closed the door behind her. Sarah lay down across the open courtyard outside her window and did not move for 2 days. Othrin sat on the rail of the chamber's outer balcony and did not fly for 2 days. Naya laid Veska on the bedding where Veska had slept every night for 10 years. And she sat beside the bedding with one hand on the small cooling flank. And she wept the way a queen weeps when the door is closed, which is to say without sound, and she sat there until the lamp burned down. And she sat there in the dark, and at the first light of morning, she got up and washed her face, and put on her plainest gown, and went down to the receiving hall, and began the day's work, because the Salt Coast was a kingdom, and the kingdom did not stop because a small pale dragon the size of a kitchen cat had finished what she had come to do. That was the cost. Naya carried it. She carried it the rest of her life. She carried it in the silence at her throat, where Veska had breathed for 10 years. She carried it in the small absence of weight on her left collarbone. She carried it in the slight habit she developed, in the years after, of touching her own throat with her fingertips when she was thinking, which the kitchen women began, very quietly and without telling her, to call the hen-kale gesture, and which their daughters and granddaughters would, 4 generations later, still make when they were thinking, without remembering why. Irish of the harbor village lived. She ran by midsummer. She grew straight and tall. She came up the harbor stones every year on the anniversary, with a small offering of bread and salt and a single white sea stone from the lower jetty, and she would leave them at the lower step of the receiving hall and not come in. And Naya would come out, and the two of them would sit on the lower step in the morning sun and not say very much. Irish became a fisherman in her own right. She married a boy from the upper river. She bore 4 children. Her eldest daughter she named Veska, which was not, by then, an unusual name on the Salt Coast. Sarah lived another 60 years. Othrin lived another 70. Naya, who had been 22 on the morning of her husband's Pyre, and 32 on the morning of Veska's choosing, lived into her 74th year. And in those 42 years, the Standing Council grew from 11 kingdoms to 29. And not one of those 29 fought a war against another in her lifetime. And the inland reaches, who never sat on the council, fought their wars at the old pace and watched, year by year, the long, quiet trade roads of the Salt Coast carrying salt and grain, and the slow daily fact of 3 living wonders that became, in time, 2, and 1, and then none. In her 70th year, Naya walked down the harbor stones at first light with Sarah beside her, and Sarah waded the shallow water as she had waded it every morning for 48 years, and at the end of the lower jetty, Sarah lowered her great forge-colored head into the salt, and breathed once, very softly, and did not lift it again. Naya sat with her in the shallow water for the rest of the day. The harbor village did not come out. The harbor village had learned, by then, when to come out, and when to stay in their doorways. At sundown, the harbor master's son and his own sons came down with the long sledges, and they took Sarah up the lower terrace and out to the salt flats where Halen's pyre had burned 48 years before, and they built a second pyre at the same place. And Naya walked into the cold ash at the rim of it at noon the next day, with one hand pressed to her throat in the gesture the kitchen women called by her name, and she sat with the ash until evening, and she walked back up the harbor stones at dusk, with Othrin on her shoulder, where Veska had once been, and she did not weep, because she had wept everything she had for Veska 40 years before, and there was nothing left in her for the open weeping of an old woman. Othrin died in her 73rd winter. Naya did not go down to the harbor stones the morning after. She sat in her chamber with one hand on the empty railing of the balcony and looked at the sky. And at noon, she sent for the harbor master's son's eldest granddaughter, whose name was Irish after her great-grandmother. And she handed the seal of the 3 wings to the girl, and she said, in a voice the granddaughter would tell her own grandchildren about a long time later, "Carry it. It is heavier than it looks. You will be enough." She did not put on the seal again. She lived 1 more year. She sat in the lower courtyard in the spring sun. She walked, slowly, with a cane. The harbor master's son had carved for her, out of an old jetty timber. She watched the harbor children play on the lower stones. She watched the new council convene, without her in the receiving hall. She drank her tea. She ate her bread. She slept long, quiet nights, without dreams. On the morning she did not wake, The household women came in and found her with her face turned toward the open balcony and one hand at her throat in the gesture they had named for her. And Irish, the granddaughter, who was queen of the Salt Coast by then, came up the long stair without a steward at either elbow, and stood at the foot of the bed, and lowered her head, and the household women did not scream. The way Bessa had taught them not to scream 43 years before, in the cold ash of a husband's pyre. And they set down what they were carrying, and they began the slow, careful work of preparing the body of the first queen of the Standing Council for her last walk down the harbor stones. They wrapped her in plain wool. They washed her hands. They left her feet bare, because she had walked the harbor stones barefoot every morning of her rule, and had said, many times, that she did not intend to be the kind of queen they put boots on in the end. They laid a single white sea stone in her closed hand. Irish, the granddaughter, queen now and forever, set her own forehead against the older woman's forehead for a long moment, and then she straightened, and she said quietly to the household women, "Carry her down the way she walked down. Carry her down the slow way." They carried her down the slow way. The harbor village came out into its doorways. The lower terrace came out into its open air. The council came out of its session. The Standing Council of the Salton Coast Reaches, which by then had 29 seats and was the longest-running peaceful body any of those coasts had ever known, came out of the receiving hall behind the new queen. And they walked the long, slow walk down the harbor stones in the spring sun, and at the lower jetty, they laid her down on a small, flat boat the harbor master's son had built for her 2 years before, in expectation of this day. And they pushed the small, flat boat out into the shallow water, and the boat caught the morning tide, and it drifted, very slowly, out past the lower stones, and out past the breakwater, and out toward the open salt, where Sira had laid down her great forge-colored head 4 years before, and the boat did not burn, because Naya had said many times that she had had quite enough of pyres in her life, and the boat did not sink, because the harbor master's son had built it not to, and the boat drifted, in the slow, long way of a boat that is taking a queen home, out into the open water of the Salt Coast, and the Salt Coast watched it go. On the lower step of the receiving hall, where Irish the grandmother had left her bread and salt and white sea stone every year for 40 years, the harbor children of the morning had already set out, without being asked, a small ring of white sea stones in the shape of 3 small wings. Irish the granddaughter, queen of the Salt Coast, stood on the upper terrace and watched the boat until the morning haze took it. She turned to the council behind her. She did not raise her voice. She said the one thing the histories of the Standing Council would later record her as having said on that morning. She was enough for them, the new queen said. We will be enough for ours. Well, the morning haze closed over the open water. The boat went on. The harbor village turned, very slowly, back to its doorways, and its nets, and its bread. The lower terrace turned, very slowly, back to its councils and its trade roads, and its slow daily fact of one living wonder, who was at that moment riding a thermal a mile, out over the bay, and who had, the histories would say, not come back to the Salt Coast for any other queen after Naya, and who had not, for that reason, been seen on the Salt Coast again. But on certain mornings, in certain springs, the harbor children would point up at a high shape against the sun and call to their mothers in voices small with wonder, and their mothers would come out into the doorways and look up, and they would say nothing, and they would touch their own throats with their fingertips in the small old gesture their grandmothers had taught them without ever saying why. And the high shape would turn, slowly, in the high air, the way a thing turns when it is looking down on a place it once loved, and it would go on, and the harbor village would go back to its bread. The Salt Coast remembered. The Salt Coast still remembers. And in the lower step of the receiving hall, where the queen of the Salt Coast still leaves bread and salt and a single white sea stone every year on the morning of the anniversary, a small ring of 3 sea stone wings still lies, weathered by 100 springs, and the children of the harbor village still know, without being told, to walk around it and not across it, the way one walks around the small grave of a thing that has finished what it came to do.